Hello, my name is Francis Fukuyama. I'm a senior fellow at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies at Stanford University. And I'm also the director of the Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law. This lecture on improving the performance and the quality of government is part of the program of the Leadership Academy for Development, or LAD. LAD is a case-based program that tries to teach up-and-coming mid-career policy professionals how to improve the performance of the private sector to make it more innovative and entrepreneurial. We need to begin with the question of why the public sector is so different from the private sector. There are commonalities, but there are a number of important constraints that the public sector faces that private companies do not face. The first of these is that public agencies cannot go bankrupt. Bankruptcy, if you think about it, for a private firm is a huge disciplining mechanism. If a company does not make profits, if it continues to lose money, it eventually runs out of capital and it has to fold its tent. And that gives a very strong incentive to the owners of the company to make it more efficient. Public agencies, by and large, cannot go bankrupt. And for that reason, it is very hard to discipline them in the same way as a private company. A second problem for the public sector is the fact that public agencies are subject to mandates not under their control. Now, a private company is in fact under a mandate, but it's usually a fairly simple, single, straightforward one. That is, the owners of the company, whether shareholders in a public company or the family owners of a small family business, want to maximize profits. That is an easily measurable goal, and it is possible to tell whether you're meeting that goal. In a public agency, by contrast, a lot of times there are multiple mandates. For example, in one of the cases that will be covered in this course, a public utility is expected to recover costs and provide services efficiently, not to lose money, but it's also expected to provide universal coverage, and especially coverage for poor people who may not be able to pay the marginal cost of the water or the electricity or whatever is being provided. And those contradictory mandates mean that the agency can never actually fully do its job and optimize both of those different values. A third characteristic of the public sector that makes it different from private companies is the fact that they cannot retain earnings. Everybody who has worked in a public agency knows that at the end of the fiscal year, if that agency is running a surplus, the big incentive is to spend it before the end of the fiscal year. If you retain those earnings, then whoever has appropriated your budget, whether a legislature or some higher up part of the government, is going to say, well, these people didn't spend all the money we gave them, they don't need it, and therefore we're going to take it away from them in the next budget cycle. In a private company, obviously, if you retain earnings by being efficient, you are richer. You are individually richer. You've made more profit for the company. And so the incentives there are very different in a public agency and in a private one. Finally, most public agencies cannot control their own factors of production. That is to say, they can't control their budgets and they cannot control their workers. Many public agencies have to work with unionized workers, or else under very cumbersome civil service rules that do not allow them to fire workers or to discipline them. The kinds of things that private sector CEOs do routinely, like engage in mergers and acquisitions, or shed divisions or merge divisions, many of those activities are not possible in a public agency. I know that this is a big generalization, but I would say that the central issue of virtually all organization theory, whether regarding the private sector or the public sector, is the question of delegated discretion. That is to say, all organizations, public or private, need to delegate authority from the top to lower ranks of the organization. There's really two systematic reasons why this becomes necessary in anything except for example, a very small family-run business. The first has to do with the question of local knowledge. In the late 1940s, the great libertarian economist Friedrich Hayek wrote a very famous article called The Uses of Knowledge in Society. At that time, he was involved in a debate, a long-standing debate with people like Joseph Schumpeter, another great economist of that generation, over whether capitalist market economies or centrally planned socialist ones were more efficient. At that time, the Soviet Union had gone through a decade of growth in which it was actually doing better than many capitalist economies in Europe and the United States that were mired in the Great Depression. And it wasn't obvious to many people which of these systems was economically, not in terms of their political centralization, but simply as economic systems, it wasn't clear to people which one was more efficient. Hayek argued that perhaps 95% of all the information in an economy was local in nature. That is to say, you're a factory floor worker, you're trying to bolt a door onto a chassis of a car, and the fasteners are the wrong size. He argued that the person that knows that is the factory floor worker. It's not the vice president of the corporation sitting in a glass tower at corporate headquarters. And therefore, the people that were close to the sources of local information were the ones that had the best information and should be empowered to make decisions. He argued that the price system in a market economy basically functioned it was efficient because it was a mechanism for connecting buyers and sellers, dispersed, decentralized buyers and sellers to one another, where price became a signal of relative scarcity, and that these would be much more accurate than any kind of centralized price-setting mechanism. And this is, in fact, something that proved to be historically correct. In the former Soviet Union, with its centrally planned economy, there used to be an office called Goskomsyen, which was Russian for the State Committee on Prices. This office basically set every price in the former Soviet Union. This is a mind-boggling ambition if you think about it. A single Boeing jetliner today could have millions of individual parts that make it up. And you imagine a bureaucracy with a few hundred bureaucrats sitting around trying to set accurate prices for a technologically complex product like that. It's basically impossible. Maybe it was vaguely achievable in the early 1920s when the system was first set up, but certainly not in an information-intensive high-tech economy. And I think that's the reason that Hayek won this debate with the people that advocated centralized planning, that market economies are simply better because they are decentralized at dealing with local knowledge. Now, local knowledge is important not just in a market, it's also important in an organization. Organizations have frontline workers. They're the people that deal with customers, they're the people that deal with suppliers, they're the human relations specialists. All of them know about their local situations in a way that people at the top of the hierarchy don't. If information in an organization has to travel from the local level up through many layers of hierarchy for someone at the top to make a decision, and then the decision is transmitted downwards, there is opportunities for distortion, for delay, for gaming that information as it passes. And therefore, most organizations see fit to delegate decision authority to lower levels of the organization. And it also allows organizations to respond much more quickly. That's why, for example, in a military organization, the commander's intent or mission orders has been the winning doctrine in high-quality military organizations. That is to say, the commander only gives broad strategic instructions to lower-level commanders who are delegated as much authority as possible to see their local situation and to act on what they understand to be the situation right in front of them. So this is the case in all organizations. They need to delegate because of the importance of local knowledge, but the moment they delegate, they begin to lose control. The agents to whom they've delegated authority may be incompetent, they may be corrupt, they may have their own agendas, they may want to take the organization in a different strategic direction than what the person at the top wants, and all of these are potential sources of organizational dysfunction. Delegation is particularly problematic in the public sector because of the expectations for what the public sector will be in terms of providing public goods and things that benefit the public interest. And it is also under much greater scrutiny, typically, than our private sector. Broadly speaking, there are two methodological approaches to thinking about organizations. First, I would describe as the economist approach. Now, you can caricature a bit the economist's view of human behavior and say that man is homo economicus, that is to say, somebody that is purely interested in material rewards and as a rational utility maximizer. Now, of course, economists do have broader views of human behavior than that, but at the core of their model is an assumption, A, that people are rational, and B, that they are selfish individuals. And under this kind of a behavioral assumption, we see that incentives, that is to say monetary incentives, matter. That's what's going to get people to change their behavior. And in thinking about organizations, economists have used what is called a principal-agent framework, by which they can understand the behavior of people in a hierarchical organizational setting. Second approach is what I would label the social capital approach, that is more typically one used by sociologists and anthropologists. They understand that human beings may be selfish individuals, but they are also intensely social animals, and a lot of their behavior is guided not by individual incentives, but by norms. That is to say, community standards and expectations for behavior. People are conformist, they want to conform to the norms around them, and in an organizational setting, this is particularly important because people have to work with one another, and the norms in the organization are critical in influencing behavior. So norms and bonding are more important in many cases than incentives. Principal-agent theory can apply both to private sector organizations and to public sector organizations. In a publicly held company, that is to say a company that sells shares to the public on a stock market, the principle is very clear. The principle are the public shareholders, the people that have bought shares of stock. They are the ones that then appoint a board of directors, which is a first-level agent. The board of directors is responsible for recruiting and hiring a CEO. The CEO then appoints senior management, and the senior management appoint the workers. And so there's a chain of delegation from the principal to several levels of agents. You can get corruption in a private sector company, in a privately owned company, if the agent does not do the bidding of the principal. And we've had cases of this. The energy firm Enron, for example, basically went bankrupt because one of its vice presidents set up a vehicle by which he could funnel money away from the company into his own bank account. Private sector organizations, public sector organizations as well can be subsumed under the principal-agent framework. In a democracy, according to democratic theory, the principle is very clear. The principles are the people, we the people of the United States, as the US Constitution says. The people, through elections, elect either a legislature or, in a presidential system, a president. The legislature appropriates money, it appoints a bureaucracy. The executive then directs that bureaucracy. They can then hire implementing organizations to actually carry out policy. And again, you have this multi-level delegation of authority from the principal, the people, through the president or the legislature, through the bureaucracy, and so on down to the street-level bureaucrats that actually implement public policies. Most of the innovations that have taken place in public policy in recent years have been efforts to make the public sector behave more like the private sector. We saw all of the basic sources of dysfunction, that there's little competition, firms cannot go bankrupt, they can't control their own factors of production, they're under multiple and confusing mandates. And many of these reforms have been efforts to replicate the disciplinary mechanisms that exist in the private sector in the public sector. This is what New Public Management was all about. New Public Management was an organizational theory. It was rolled out in practice in places like New Zealand in the 1980s and 1990s that tried to treat public agencies as if they were businesses. They would write contracts with the directors of the agencies with explicit performance targets. If they didn't meet the performance targets, they were out the door in the next hiring cycle. They did a lot of measurement to see whether performance was up to standards. And in return for this type of very specific quantitative accountability, the agents were given more autonomy, more ability to make their own decisions to suit the local conditions that they saw fit. New public management has been controversial in many countries. It's worked well in some and not so well in others. That's a separate discussion. Another attempt to introduce market-like principles was to add an exit option in the public sector. This is an idea that was really voiced initially by Milton Friedman, who said the problem with public schools is that most parents don't have any choice. There's a monopoly state provider of public education, and if they're not doing their job, unlike a consumer who can take their consumer dollars from one product to another, parents in a public school system didn't have that choice. They had to go to the local public school. And he said, why not, instead of forcing parents to have this single choice, give parents a voucher or a certain equivalent amount of money as the system was spending on educating their child, and allow that family to send their child to whatever school seemed to be doing the best job, to give people school choice. And this has led to the school choice movement, to vouchers, and to competition, the attempt to inject competition into educational systems. Another reform that has been championed by institutions like the World Bank is what's called wage decompression. In many public sectors, people were hired not on the basis of merit and performance. In many developing countries, people were hired not on the basis of merit and not rewarded for performance, but basically as a matter of patronage.